tendencies are.
And they punish those tendencies, at least implicitly. And now, if male ambition serves power and oppression, then you can understand why early manifestations of that might be worth punishing, especially if that was culturally a cultural consequence. But if the fundamental male drive is something like reciprocity and competence, and say aim, because I think that's relevant to the use of weapons, then the punishing of that, the viewing it as only serving power and oppression instead of competence and reciprocity, that's an awful thing. And I think, and I'd like to know what you think about this, but boys are not doing that well in school, and they're all the way through, kindergarten through university, they're dropping out. And they're also increasingly and less interested in sexual activity of all sorts, even masturbation. And I think that it's a consequence of this attitude. It's like they're punished for a male typical pattern of behavior that's improperly associated with dominance right from day one. So
boys are more often kicked out of school. That's a big problem, and that has probably to do with their tendency of roughhousing and mock fighting, which they do all the time. The way I look at that is that that's a primate pattern. All the male primates like to do that, mock fighting. And we at our schools in the West, we have decided to stop that and to say you shouldn't be touching each other.
I worked with this guy named Dan Olwis, and he wrote a great book called Bullying, What It Is and What We Can Do About It. Very straightforward guy, kind of like a 50s engineer. And he reduced the bullying incidents and associated alcoholism and criminality in Scandinavia, in a number of countries, by 50%. And he went into schools. He was really careful because he defined bullying very particularly. He said he didn't associate it with rough and tumble play, for example, because he actually had a clue. He said, you mentioned earlier that the reciprocal male alpha who's competent breaks up unfair fights. Okay, so that's what Olwis did. He went into schools and he said, look, you can intervene in an incident of aggression when there's a clear and inequitable power balance. So if a 12-year-old's beating up an 8-year-old, or if two 10-year-olds are picking on a 10-year-old, and then he taught the kids, you can go tattle to a teacher, which is otherwise forbidden, as all children know, and most adults should remember. It's your ethical responsibility to inform a person in authority if you see violence with power imbalance. And then he taught the teachers and the parents the same thing, this very narrow focus on a very specific form of aggressive behavior that wasn't play. And no one's paying any attention to it in North America, even though it's a stunning body of research, and the only body of research I know that shows a positive effect of the attempts to socially ameliorate antisocial behavior. But instead, we get this overreaction that includes all elements of play, rough and tumble play in particular. And it's also why boys are medicated. If Panksepp is right, they manifest this boisterous rough and tumble play desire, and it's disruptive in classrooms. And the best quick trip out of that is an amphetamine, which suppresses play behavior. That's what it does technically and biochemically.
Yeah, it makes me think of, I did a lot of studies of reconciliation behavior. So what happens after a fight? Who reconciles with whom and so on? And actually, males are quite good. Males are good at fighting, but also good at reconciling after fights. And in those studies of reconciliation behavior, there were some developmental psychologists who started looking at children. We did the studies on the primates who kiss and embrace after a fight, or sometimes have sex after a fight, things like that. But they did studies in human cultures. And what they found is that Japanese children reconcile a lot more than Western children after fights and are much better at conflict resolution. And the reason they gave, this is not my study, but the reason they gave is that in Japan, the teachers don't break up fights. Well, of course, except if they're killing each other, but
right.
They usually don't break up fights. They let the kids fight. And if they think it needs to be interrupted or calmed down, they send another child, an older child. They send another child to mediate between them. So the
That's so smart, because otherwise too, the kid that's getting beat up is now vilified because a teacher had to intervene on his behalf. So now he was a bully victim to begin with, let's say, and now he can't even stand up for himself, and a teacher has to come to his aid. It's a terrible status defeat for him.
In the primates, of course, there is a lot of reconciliation. There's also mediation in reconciliation. So older females who bring parties together sometimes. But they all learn in their lifetime how to fight and how to reconcile after fights. And I'm from a family of 6 boys. Maybe my interest in conflict resolution was partly because as a boy in a boy family, you learn how to do these things.
Yeah, well, you know, okay, so one of the things that psychologists like Jonathan Haidt have commented on is this culture of fragility that we've produced and emotional overreaction. And I think the comment you just made, all those are germane to that, because we don't know how many siblings or peers a child needs to be exposed to in order to become resilient and learn to engage in reconciliation. So imagine the typical human family wouldn't have had one child, would have had multiple, so they'd have to be strategizing and jockeying for attention in a way that didn't cause undue tyranny and aggression. So first of all, we have lots of single child families or 2-child families, but single often, and then also to much older parents. And so if the children are actually being socialized in large part, let's say by their siblings in a more naturalistic human community, part of the reason for this emergent fragility could well be that they haven't had to engage in, say, that Japanese style of conflict that isn't mediated by parents, and they haven't learned to reconcile. I want to point out to the viewers and listeners too that Dr. DeWall's work on reconciliation is also of groundbreaking importance as far as I'm concerned, because he put the other shoe dropped with the work on reconciliation. Because you can think, well, conflict is a terrible thing, aggression is a terrible thing, and the aggressive males are power hungry and demonic and dominant. But you showed very clearly that the sophisticated males are experts at reconciliation, and sometimes that expertise even exceeds that of the females.
And all of that needs to be learned. So you need to provide learning opportunities. And if it's not in a family, if the family has just 1 or 2 children, then you need to bring children together somehow in your neighborhood or in a school, or you need to give them the opportunity to learn these things. And I think we are very good at removing these opportunities. And that's partly...
Or forbidding them even.
Yeah, there's partly a fear of competition. So for example, I've read in the psychology literature that they say that women have very good friendships, wonderful friendships, deep friendships, and so on. But men are too competitive. Men are hierarchical and competitive.
Utter rubbish.
Yeah, and that's what they say.